Token for the Dead, a Mr. James story. It was in the late summer of 1903 that I first came to Fenstowe, a hamlet so inconsequential that even the Ordnance Survey seemed to have marked it with reluctance. My purpose was unexceptional, indeed positively tedious to anyone not afflicted with my particular enthusiasm for sepulchral monuments. The Society for the Preservation of Ecclesiastical Antiquities had commissioned a catalogue of pre-Reformation burial inscriptions in the eastern counties, and Fenstowe's ruinous church of St. Eldred the Martyr, though scarcely mentioned in Pevsner, had earned a footnote in a 17th century diocesan visitation as possessing divers stones of the old fashion, some defaced, some best left unread. The latter phrase, I confess, had piqued my interest. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon, having taken the branch line from Norwich as far as Wroxham, and thence a dog-cart driven by a taciturn fellow who seemed surprised that anyone should want to visit Fenstowe at all. The landscape through which we passed was characteristic of that curious borderland between fen and coast, flat as beaten copper, scattered with pollarded willows, and given over to marsh birds, whose cries seemed always to carry a note of warning. The very light had a peculiar quality, as though filtered through water. The village itself was hardly more than a scattering of flint cottages along a single rutted lane. There was a public house, the Martyr's Rest, appropriately enough, and a post office that doubled as a general shop. Of inhabitants I saw few, though I noted several curtains twitch as our cart passed. My driver deposited me and my trunk at the inn without ceremony, and departed before I could press a shilling into his hand. Mrs. Garnham, the landlady, was a stout woman of perhaps 50 years, with that particular expression of guarded civility that one encounters in remote places when confronted with strangers. Yes, she had a room. No visitors were uncommon. The church? Oh, that was up the lane, and through the Lich Gate, though she couldn't say when services had last been held there. The building was unsafe, she understood. The parish had been amalgamated with Great Fenstowe, 3 miles distant, these 20 years past. You'll be wanting your supper at 6, I expect, she said, and it was not quite a question. I assured her that would be most acceptable, and inquired whether there were any local records or histories I might consult. She looked at me with what I can only describe as wary amusement. Records? I shouldn't think so, sir. Rector Blythe over at Great Fenstowe might have something, but he's not been here above 5 years. The old things, well, they're in the church, I suppose. What's left of them, if you can read them. There was an odd emphasis on that last phrase. I spent the remainder of the afternoon settling in and examining my maps and notes. St. Eldred, I had discovered, was an obscure figure, even by the standards of obscure saints, supposedly martyred by Danish raiders in the 9th century, though the details were suspiciously vague. The church dedicated to him had been substantially rebuilt in the 14th century, with further alterations in Tudor times. The visitation I had mentioned noted irregularities in burial practices that had since been corrected, though the nature of these irregularities was not specified. After a plain but substantial supper, I retired early, intending to begin my work at first light. The church of St. Eldred stood perhaps a quarter-mile from the village proper, approached by a footpath that wound between hawthorn hedges heavy with berries. The building itself was unremarkable, flint and rubble construction, square tower, tiled roof missing several tiles. The churchyard was more extensive than I had anticipated, and badly overgrown. Nettles and brambles had claimed much of it, and the gravestones, mostly 18th and 19th century, leaned at drunken angles among the long grass. The church door was unlocked, which surprised me, though perhaps it was simply that there was nothing left worth stealing. Inside, the air was cold and damp, despite the season, and heavy with that distinctive scent of old stone, mildewed wood, and ancient plaster. Bird droppings spattered the pews. The font had been overturned, vandals presumably, and lay in two pieces near the west door. But the monuments, those were another matter. Along the north wall were set 3 or 4 medieval tomb slabs, and in the chancel floor were several more, badly worn but bearing the ghostly traces of incised figures and Lombardic lettering. I set to work with my notebook and brass rubbing materials, and for several hours was thoroughly absorbed in my task. It was while examining a particularly fine 14th century slab showing a priest in Eucharistic vestments that I noticed the small recess in the wall behind the altar. It had been partially bricked up, rather crudely, leaving an opening perhaps 8 inches square. Curious, I fetched my electric torch from my bag and directed its beam into the cavity. The space beyond was larger than I had expected, a kind of abbreviated crypt or charnel chamber. I could make out bones, certainly, though whether human or animal, I could not immediately determine. But what caught my attention was a small wooden box, plain and worm-eaten, resting on what appeared to be a stone shelf. I am not by temperament a superstitious man, but I will confess to a moment's hesitation. There was something about that dark opening and the box within that spoke of deliberate concealment. Still, scholarship conquers squeamishness, and after widening the gap slightly, the old mortar crumbled easily. I was able to reach in and retrieve the box. It was light, and when I opened it, the lid was not fastened. I found it contained only a single object, a disc of dark metal, perhaps 3 inches in diameter, strung on a much decayed leather cord. The disc was of lead, I thought, or possibly pewter, badly tarnished and pitted with age. On one face was incised a curious design, a hand, palm outward, with what might have been an eye in its center. Around the rim ran lettering in a script I did not immediately recognize, though it had the character of debased Latin. I wrapped the object carefully in my handkerchief and slipped it into my pocket. Then, feeling oddly as though I had been observed in some transgression, I replaced the box and withdrew from the church. That evening, after another plain supper, I examined my find more closely by lamplight in my room. The disc was certainly very old, medieval at the latest, possibly earlier. The design was crudely executed, but oddly unsettling. The eye in the palm seemed to follow one's gaze. As for the inscription, I copied it carefully into my notebook. QVI Portet, sign VM, Reddit AD Terram. My Latin is serviceable, if not elegant, and after some consideration, I rendered it as, "Who bears the sign, returns to earth, a burial token, then." And yet there was something irregular about it. Why would such a thing be sealed away, rather than interred with its owner? I determined to consult the parish registers in the morning, if such things existed. In the meantime, I set the disc on my bedside table and attempted to read, but found my attention wandering. The room seemed colder than it should have been, and once or twice I thought I heard a faint scratching sound, as though something small were scrabbling behind the wainscoting. Mice, no doubt. Old buildings are full of them. I slept poorly. My dreams were confused and unpleasant, full of dark earth and the sense of something buried, but not at rest. I woke once, quite suddenly, with a conviction that someone had knocked on my door. But when I lit my candle and looked, there was no one in the passage, and the house was silent, save for the creaking of old timbers. When I rose and dressed the next morning, I noticed that the disc had left a faint discoloration on the table where it had lain, a greenish mark, like verdigris, though I could have sworn I had wiped it clean the night before. Mrs. Garnham directed me to a Miss Arabella Wren, who lived in a cottage at the far end of the village and was said to know more about Fenstowe's history than anyone living. I found her to be a sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 70 years, who received me with a mixture of curiosity and something I can only describe as careful assessment. "A scholar, are you?" she said, once I had explained my errand. "Well, there are not many of those who trouble themselves with St. Eldred's, not anymore." Her sitting room was crowded with the accumulation of decades, china dogs, framed silhouettes, a stuffed owl in a glass case that regarded me with unblinking reproach. She offered me tea, which I accepted, and shortbread from a tin decorated with a view of Balmoral. "The registers," I began, "are they still extant?" "After a fashion. The old ones were moved to the diocesan archive, 30 years ago or more. I have copies of some entries. My late father was churchwarden, you see, and he made transcriptions. They're not complete, mind. Some pages were damaged. Damaged? Water, I believe, or possibly deliberate defacement. One cannot always tell." She regarded me steadily. "What is it you're looking for, Mr. Dunning?" "James Dunning. I'm cataloguing the monuments, primarily, but I confess I'm curious about the church's history. It seems to have been, forgive me, rather neglected." "Neglected?" She smiled thinly. "Yes, one might say that. There are reasons, Mr. Dunning. The church has not been much loved in Fenstowe, not for a very long time." I waited. She was clearly deciding whether to say more. "My father," she said at length, "used to say that St. Eldred's was built on the wrong sort of ground. There had been something there before, you understand, not Christian. The old church tried to sanctify it, but some things won't be sanctified. They just wait." "I see," I said, though I did not really. "And the burials?" "The visitation I read mentioned irregularities." Her expression sharpened. "You've been doing your research." "Yes, there were irregularities, bodies buried without proper rites, or buried too well, weighted down perhaps, or bound. My father found references to a case in the 1660s, a man named Caro, I forget which. He had been some sort of cunning man, or so the story went, when he died, and there was some question about how he died. The rector refused him burial in consecrated ground, but the family insisted, and they had influence, so a compromise was reached. He was buried, but not as others were. "In what way?" "Certain precautions were taken, and a token was placed with him. Something to keep him in his grave, he might say, to prevent his returning." She paused. "It's all nonsense, of course. Superstition. But my father believed there was something to it. He said that some years after the burial, there had been disturbances, and that the rector at the time had the grave disturbed and the token removed and hidden away, so that it could neither be used nor allow what it bound to be released." I felt a cold sensation in the pit of my stomach. "This token," I said carefully, "what form did it take?" "I couldn't say for certain, but there's a notation in one of the transcripts. Let me see if I can find it." She rose and went to a cluttered escritoire, from which, after some searching, she produced a folder of yellowed papers. She leafed through them, muttering to herself, then stopped. "Here, this is from the parish register. October 1667. This sign taken from the grave of T. Carow and walled up in the holy place, that it may neither be worn nor found, and the soul therein bound remain bound until the judgment. That's all. May I see? She handed me the paper. The handwriting was crabbed and difficult, but the words were as she had read them, and there, in the margin, someone had sketched a small rough diagram, a hand with an eye in its palm. I walked back to the inn in a state of some agitation. The rational part of my mind insisted that this was merely an interesting historical curiosity, a token associated with 17th century burial superstitions, nothing more. But another part, less rational but no less insistent, whispered that I had made a very grave mistake in removing the disc from its hiding place. The afternoon was overcast, and a chill wind had risen, carrying the scent of rain and salt marsh. As I passed the church, I noticed that the lych gate, which had been open that morning, now stood closed. I had certainly not closed it myself. At the inn, Mrs. Garnham informed me that I had received a visitor, a gentleman, if you could call him that, who had asked after me, and then departed without leaving a name. When I pressed her for a description, she seemed oddly reluctant to speak. Tall, she said at last, very tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Black, all black. I didn't care for the look of him, Mr. Dunning, nor the smell. The smell? Like earth, she said, like fresh-turned earth. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. Did he say what he wanted? He asked if you were staying here, and if you'd been to the church. I told him nothing. It's not my place to gossip about guests. He left after that. But he said, she paused, clearly uncomfortable. He said to tell you that something of his had been taken, and he would have it back. I attempted to smile reassuringly. I expect it was some local, eccentric Mrs. Garnham. I shouldn't worry. But I did worry. That evening, I took the disc from my pocket and examined it again. In the lamplight, the eye in the palm seemed almost to gleam, and I could have sworn the metal was warmer than it should have been. On impulse, I tried to decipher more of the inscription, but the letters seemed to shift and blur before my eyes, and after a time I had to look away, feeling slightly dizzy. I wrapped the disc in my handkerchief again and placed it in my trunk, which I locked. Then I pushed a chair against my door. A ridiculous precaution, I told myself, but somehow necessary. Sleep was long in coming. When it came at last, I dreamed again. But these dreams were more vivid, more terrible than before. I dreamed of a grave being opened by moonlight, and of hands, pale, earth-stained hands, reaching up from the black soil. I dreamed of a figure rising, wrapped in a shroud that fell away in rotted fragments, revealing a face that was at once human and terribly wrong, as though death itself had worn human features as a poor-fitting mask. And I dreamed that this figure walked through Fenstowe in the darkness, seeking something, seeking someone. I woke to find myself standing at my window, though I had no memory of leaving my bed. The moon was nearly full, and by its light I could see the churchyard and the dark bulk of St. Eldred's, and there among the gravestones I saw, or thought I saw, a tall figure in black, perfectly still, facing toward the inn. As I watched, it raised one hand, palm outward, as if in greeting or summons. I stepped back from the window with a cry, and when I looked again, the churchyard was empty. I did not sleep again that night. As soon as it was light, I dressed and went downstairs, intending to return the disc to where I had found it and have done with the whole business. But Mrs. Garnham intercepted me in the passage, her face pale and strained. "Mr. Dunning, I must speak with you. There was something here last night. I heard it moving about the house, on the stairs, in the passage outside your room. I thought at first it was you, but when I looked, there was nothing, only," she hesitated, "only wet footprints, as though someone had walked here straight from the marshes with mud on their boots, but they led only to your door, and then stopped. And there was a smell, sir, that same smell of earth. I felt my mouth go dry. Mrs. Garnham, I believe I may have brought something into your house, something connected with the church that has caused this disturbance. I intend to return it today. I'm deeply sorry for any alarm." She looked at me for a long moment. "You've been to the hidden place then? You've taken the sign? You knew of it?" "My mother told me, and her mother told her, that it was hidden in the church and must never be moved, that it kept something bound that should never walk again." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They say Thomas Caro was no ordinary man, that he had learned things in the old religion that he should not have learned, that when he died, and they do say he was murdered, though none could prove it, his body would not rest quietly. So the rector at that time had a sign made, a token of binding, and it was placed upon his corpse with certain words spoken over it, and after that he lay still until the token was removed." "Until the token was removed," she echoed. "And now you've taken it again. Oh, sir, you must put it back, and you must do it properly. Or else—" She did not finish, but as we stood there in the dim passage, we both heard it, a slow, heavy knock from somewhere in the house, then another, then silence. "He's looking for it," Mrs. Garnham whispered. "Looking for his sign. God help us, sir, you must give it back." I went immediately to my room to retrieve the disc, but when I unlocked my trunk and unwrapped the handkerchief, I found that the metal had changed. The surface, which had been merely tarnished, was now covered in a greenish-black patina that came away on my fingers like wet ash, and the inscription had become more distinct, as though the letters had been cut deeper overnight. But that was not the worst of it. When I looked closely at the design, the hand with the eye, I saw that the eye had opened wider. I am not easily frightened, but I dropped the thing with an involuntary cry. It fell to the floor with a dull clank, and lay there with the eye seeming to stare up at me in mute accusation. I forced myself to pick it up, wrapping it in a fresh handkerchief. Then I descended to find Mrs. Garnham. "I'm going to the church now," I told her. "I'll restore the disc to its place. Hopefully that will be an end to it." "I pray it will be, sir, but you must be careful. If he is abroad, if he knows you have it, he will not let you return it easily." "You speak as though this Caro were alive." "I speak," she said quietly, "as though he were not quite dead. There's a difference." The walk to the church had never seemed so long. The morning was grey and oppressive, with low clouds that seemed to press down upon the flat landscape. No birds sang. As I approached the lych gate, I saw that it stood open again, and beyond it, the churchyard looked different, wilder, darker, as though the neglect of decades had somehow accelerated overnight. The church door was ajar. I did not recall leaving it so. Inside, the temperature had dropped noticeably. My breath misted in the air. The nave was darker than before, and for a moment I had the irrational conviction that the building had somehow grown larger, its walls receding into deeper shadows. I made my way to the chancel, where the recess in the wall gaped like a wound. I shone my torch into the cavity. The wooden box was still there, lying on its side, its contents scattered among the bones. and I could see now that they were most certainly human, lay what appeared to be fragments of cloth and leather, all much decayed. There was something else too, scratches on the stone, as though something had clawed at the walls from within. With hands that trembled, despite my best efforts, I placed the disc back into the box and set it on the shelf. Then I began to replace the bricks in the opening, using fragments of mortar from the floor. It was rough work, but I managed to close off most of the gap. As I fitted the last brick into place, I heard a sound behind me, a soft exhalation, like a breath, but far too prolonged to be human. I turned. He stood in the chancel arch, tall and impossibly thin, dressed in black that seemed less like clothing than like an absence of light. His face was in shadow, but I could see his hands, white hands, with earth beneath the fingernails. One hand was raised, palm outward, and in the center of that palm something gleamed. An eye, a living eye, red-rimmed and weeping, staring at me with an expression of inexpressible hunger. "You have stolen from me," he said, and his voice was like wind through a hollow tree. "You have taken my sign. Return it." I tried to speak, but my throat was closed with terror. "I cannot rest without it," the figure continued, taking a step forward. "I cannot remain in the earth. The sign was forged to bind me, and without it I walk. Without it I hunger. Return it, and I will go back into the darkness. Refuse, and I will take it from you." He moved closer, and as he did so, I saw his face. Oh God, his face. It was the face of a corpse, 3 centuries dead, with skin like old parchment, drawn tight over bone, and eyes, his natural eyes, that were nothing but hollow sockets. Only the eye in his palm lived, and it fixed upon me with terrible intensity. "It is here," I managed to gasp, gesturing toward the recess. "I have returned it. Take it and go." "It must be given," he said, "freely given, from your hand to mine. That is the compact. That is the only way." With shaking fingers, I pried away the bricks I had just laid. The box was there, and the disc within it. I took it up. How cold it was, cold as the grave, and held it out to him. He reached for it. His fingers closed around mine, and I felt a cold so intense it was like burning. The eye in his palm blazed with terrible light, and for an instant I seemed to see not the church around me, but another place, a place of endless darkness and suffocating earth, where something moved and clawed and could not die. Then he had the disc. He clutched it to his breast with both hands, and the eye in his palm closed slowly, like a wound healing. The terrible hunger faded from his face, replaced by something that might have been relief, or might have been merely the absence of torment. "Bound again," he whispered, "bound until the final trumpet sounds." He began to dissolve. There is no other word for it. The darkness that clothed him seemed to leak away like smoke, revealing beneath it only a glimpse of bone and rotted cerements. Then even these were gone, and there was nothing but a slight disturbance in the air, and the scent of earth and old decay. I stood alone in the empty church dot. My hands shook so violently that I could barely grip the bricks to seal the recess, but I did it, mortaring them in place as best I could, and then piling broken stones before the wall for good measure. When I was finished, I stood for a long moment in the cold silence of that place, listening to my own ragged breathing. Then I heard another sound, soft footsteps behind me. I spun around with a cry, but it was only Miss Wren standing in the nave with an expression of profound concern. I saw you come to the church, she said quietly, and I feared. Well, I see it is done. You knew, I said, my voice hoarse. You knew what would happen if I took the disc. I suspected, but I have learned that scholars do not listen to warnings. They must discover things for themselves. I am only glad that you had the wisdom to return it. She moved closer, her eyes searching my face. You saw him then. Thomas Caro. I saw something that wore his shape. Yes, he was a man who sought power over death itself. He learned forbidden arts, made compacts that should never have been made, and when his neighbors discovered what he was, they murdered him, buried him alive in the dead of night, far from consecrated ground. But his family had influence, and they forced the rector to accept his burial in the churchyard. Only the rector was a wise man. He had the sign made, a token of binding, inscribed with words of power, and placed it upon the corpse. As long as it remained, Caro could not rise, but when it was moved, he walked until the sign was returned to him. Now he is bound again, and will remain so until the earth itself gives up its dead. I looked at the sealed recess. It should never be opened again. No, she agreed, but these things have a way of being forgotten. A century passes, 2 centuries, and new scholars come, full of curiosity and ignorance. They dig, they pry, they remove what should not be removed, and so the cycle continues. I will write an account, I said, a warning to others. She smiled sadly. Perhaps, but will they believe it? Will you yourself believe it? In time? Or will you come to think it was merely a dream, a fever, a moment of madness, in an old church? I had no answer. I left Fenstowe the following morning. Mrs. Garnham seemed relieved to see me go, though she would accept no payment beyond what I had already given her. As my cart pulled away, I looked back at the village, at its huddled cottages, its rutted lane, and in the distance, the square tower of St. Eldred's rising above the trees. I did not return to the church before my departure. The journey home seemed endless. I changed trains at Norwich, took tea in the station buffet, read a newspaper without comprehending a word. All the while, I could feel the memory of that cold hand upon mine, and the terrible gaze of the eye in the palm. I completed my report for the society, noting the monuments I had documented, and recommending that St. Eldred's be added to the list of ecclesiastical sites requiring preservation. I made no mention of the recess, the disc, or Thomas Caro. Let them remain forgotten, or at least let the next scholar who discovers them have the wit to leave well enough alone. But I did write this account. Whether it will serve as a warning, or merely as an amusing tale to be read before the fire on winter evenings, I cannot say. I can only attest that every word is true, as far as I understand truth, and that since that time I have been far more cautious in my antiquarian pursuits. That should have been the end of it. In most respects, it was. I returned to my work, to my comfortable rooms in Cambridge, to the familiar round of lectures and research. The memory of Fenstowe began to fade, acquiring the uncertain quality of a half-remembered dream. But some weeks after my return, I received a parcel in the post. It had been sent from Norfolk, from Great Fenstowe to be precise, though the sender had left no name. Inside, wrapped in coarse brown paper, was a small notebook bound in cracked leather. It was old, very old, and the pages were filled with a spidery handwriting that I recognized from Miss Wren's transcriptions. The diary of the Reverend Edmund Fawkes, rector of Fenstowe 1665 to 1690. Most of the entries concerned routine parish business, baptisms, burials, tithes collected or overdue, but toward the end, the tone changed. October 1667. The thing is done. God forgive me if I have erred, but I could see no other course. The family insists that he be buried in consecrated ground, and Sir William's influence is such that I dare not refuse. But I will not bury Thomas Carew as a Christian man. I have consulted with learned men, Dr. Brown of Norwich, and another whom I will not name, and they have instructed me in the making of a sign. It is worked in lead, with certain characters, and the figure of an eye, which sees that which cannot die. This I have placed upon his breast, and spoken over it the words I was given. May it hold him until the day of judgment. November 1667. There have been disturbances in the churchyard. Sounds of digging, though none can be found at work. The grave of T.C. appears disturbed, though the earth is not broken. I have kept watch 2 nights, and seen nothing, yet I am convinced that something stirs. January 1668. It is worse. He has been seen, or something, wearing his likeness. 3 persons have come to me, all telling the same tale. A tall figure in black, wandering the marshes at night, with something that gleams in his hand. I have examined the grave. The sign is gone. I know not how, but it has been taken, or he has cast it off. Either way, he walks abroad. February 1668. We have opened the grave. The coffin was empty, save for his cerements, much disturbed. Of T.C. himself, there was no sign, but we found the token, the sign, lying at the foot of the grave, as though he had divested himself of it. We have taken it, and I have sealed it, in the church, in the old crypt, behind the altar. I have written upon it the words of binding. Pray God it holds. March 1668. He has not been seen these 3 weeks. I believe he has returned to the earth. The sign holds him. Let none disturb it, lest they release that which should never walk in daylight. The diary ended there, but on the final page, written in a different hand, in ink that looked much fresher, was a single line. He is not always held. I sat for a long time with that notebook in my hands, feeling the old fear return like a chill draught. Then I rose and locked the book in the bottom drawer of my desk, where it remains to this day. I have not spoken of these matters to anyone who would believe me, and yet there are nights, particularly in autumn, when the wind blows from the east and carries with it the smell of marshes and salt, when I wake with the certainty that someone stands outside my door. Someone tall and thin, dressed in black, with one pale hand raised. I do not open the door on those nights, and I have removed from my shelves all books concerning the antiquities of Norfolk. There is one final thing I must mention, though I confess it disturbs me more than anything else in this narrative. Last month, I received a letter from the Society, asking if I would be willing to return to Fenstowe. It seems that St. Eldred's has been granted funds for restoration, and they require a more detailed survey of the monuments before work can begin. They mentioned particularly the need to examine certain architectural features in the chancel, including what appears to be a sealed medieval crypt or charnel chamber. I wrote back declining, citing ill health. It is not entirely false. I have not slept well since receiving that letter, because I know what will happen. Some young and enthusiastic scholar will accept the commission. He will go to Fenstowe, armed with notebooks and measuring tapes, and that particular combination of curiosity and confidence that marks our profession. He will examine the chancel, He will notice the sealed recess, and he will open it. Perhaps he will have the wisdom to leave what he finds untouched. Perhaps he will recognize the warning signs, the unease that pervades that place, the sense of something watching, waiting. Perhaps he will hear the story from Miss Wren, if she still lives, and have the sense to heed it. But I do not think so. We are a stubborn breed. We antiquarians, we see a locked door and think only of what might lie beyond it. We find a buried object and think of scholarship, of publication, of adding to the sum of human knowledge. We never think, or we think too late, that some things are buried for a reason, that some knowledge is not meant to be uncovered. I can only hope that whoever goes will be more fortunate than I was, that he will return the sign before it is too late, that he will understand what I learned in that cold church, facing something that should have been 3 centuries dead. There are places where the past is not quite past, where the dead are not quite dead, and where certain tokens, certain signs, certain words keep at bay things that must not be allowed to walk freely in the world. It is now 3 years since my visit to Fenstowe. In that time, I have thrown myself into my work with renewed vigor, taking on projects that keep me close to Cambridge and far from the eastern counties. I have published papers on Norman fonts, on medieval brasses, on perpendicular window tracery, all thoroughly respectable subjects with no hint of the uncanny about them. And yet, last week, quite by chance, I encountered in the library a young man named Foster, newly elected to a fellowship at King's, full of enthusiasm and scholarly ambition. We fell into conversation, as scholars do, comparing notes on our respective fields of research. He mentioned, quite casually, that he had been commissioned to survey several churches in Norfolk, including, he said, a most interesting place called Fenstowe. Do you know it? The church is dedicated to some obscure local saint, Saint Eldred, I believe. Apparently there's a sealed crypt that no one has examined for centuries. I'm hoping to persuade the authorities to let me open it. Just think what might be inside. Medieval reliquaries perhaps, or ecclesiastical plate hidden away during the Reformation. I felt my blood run cold. Foster, I said, keeping my voice level with some effort, I must strongly advise you against that course of action. The church is unstable, dangerous. You would do better to leave it alone. He laughed, the easy, confident laugh of youth. My dear Dunning, I appreciate your concern, but surely you, of all people, understand the importance of scholarship. We can't let superstition or structural concerns prevent us from uncovering England's ecclesiastical heritage. Besides, I've already received approval from the diocese. The work begins next month. I tried again. There are reasons that crypt was sealed, historical reasons. It would be unwise to disturb it. Unwise. His eyebrows rose. You sound like a character from one of those penny dreadfuls. Come now, Dunning. You're a man of science. Surely you don't believe in curses and ghostly warnings. What could I say that I had held a centuries-old token in my hand and felt the grip of something that should have been dead, that I had seen a corpse walk and speak? He would think me mad. Perhaps I was mad. Simply be careful, I said at last, and if you find anything unusual, anything at all, leave it where it lies. Of course, he said, clearly humoring me. I shall be the very model of archaeological propriety. We parted cordially enough, but I could see he thought me an old fool, grown timid and superstitious in my middle years. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps I imagined it all. Perhaps there is some rational explanation for everything that happened. A fever, a momentary madness, a waking dream, brought on by overwork and the oppressive atmosphere of that decaying church. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I know that young Foster, with his confidence and his enthusiasm and his complete ignorance of what lurks in certain dark corners of our ancient land, is about to make the same mistake I made. I have written him a letter, a long detailed letter, recounting everything that occurred during my visit to Fenstowe. I have described the disc, the inscription, the figure that walked. I have copied out the relevant entries from Rector Fawkes's diary. I have begged him, in the strongest possible terms, to abandon his plans. The letter sits on my desk, sealed and addressed, but I have not posted it, because I know with a terrible certainty that it will do no good. He will read it, if he reads it at all, and smile at poor old Dunning's delusions. He will show it to his colleagues, perhaps, as an amusing example of how even trained scholars can fall prey to suggestion and imagination, and he will go to Fenstowe. He will enter St. Eldred's. He will find the sealed recess, and he will open it. This manuscript was found among the papers of Dr. James Dunning following his death in 1906. Dr. Dunning, a respected antiquarian and fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge, was known in his later years for an uncharacteristic reluctance to travel to the eastern counties, despite having published extensively on the ecclesiastical architecture of that region early in his career. The manuscript is dated 1903 to 1906 and appears to be a personal account of events Dr. Dunning experienced during a research trip to Norfolk. Whether these events occurred as described or represent some form of psychological disturbance cannot be determined with certainty. However, certain facts may be verified. The village of Fenstowe does exist, as does the church of St. Eldred the Martyr, though the latter has been deconsecrated and is maintained only as an historical structure. A sealed recess in the chancel wall was discovered in 1904 during restoration work led by Mr. Philip Foster, then a junior fellow at King's College, Cambridge. Mr. Foster's own account of what occurred during the opening of this recess has not survived. However, a brief notice appeared in the Cambridge Chronicle in November 1904, stating that Mr. Foster had been taken suddenly ill while conducting research in Norfolk and had been admitted to a private sanatorium near London, suffering from nervous exhaustion. He resigned his fellowship shortly thereafter and withdrew from academic life. According to records, he spent the remaining years of his life. He died in 1931 in rural Hertfordshire and never published any of his research on Norfolk churches. The recess at St. Eldred's was resealed in 1905 by order of the diocesan authorities. No official record exists of what, if anything, was found within it. Local tradition maintains that the church is unlucky, and despite periodic attempts to establish a congregation there, services have never been successfully resumed. In Dr. Dunning's effects was found a small leather notebook, later identified as the diary of the Reverend Edmund Fawkes, rector of Fenstowe from 1665 to 1690. The final entry, written in a different hand and apparently added much later, has been examined by several experts in forensic document analysis. Their conclusion is that the ink used for this entry is modern, dating from approximately 1903 to 1904, though how or why this edition was made remains unexplained. The notebook is currently held in the archives of the Cambridge University Library catalogued but not on public display. In preparing Dr. Dunning's papers for deposit in the college archives, the present editor discovered one additional document, a letter, sealed but never posted, addressed to Mr. Philip Foster. The letter contains a detailed warning about the sealed recess at St. Eldred's, and concludes with the following paragraph. My dear Foster, I know you will think me a foolish old man, frightened by shadows. Perhaps I am, but I implore you, if you find anything in that recess, particularly a disc of lead or pewter, inscribed with certain symbols, do not touch it, do not remove it, do not, for the love of God and your own soul, attempt to study it or take it away. Some things are buried for a reason. Some doors are meant to remain closed. This is not superstition. This is not the raving of age. This is the testimony of one who has looked into the abyss and barely escaped being drawn into it. Heed my warning. Leave Fenstowe alone. The letter is dated October 1904, approximately 1 month before Mr. Foster's collapse. Whether Dr. Dunning's account represents actual events, delusion, or some form of psychological allegory remains a matter for individual judgment. What is certain is that Dr. Dunning believed implicitly in what he had experienced, and that this belief shaped the final years of his life. The Church of St. Eldred the Martyr stands to this day. The sealed recess in the chancel wall has never been reopened. It is not my place to say whether what Dr. Dunning encountered was real in the strictest sense. I am merely a scholar, tasked with organizing and preserving documents. But I will confess that when my research required me to visit Fenstowe last summer to verify certain details, I did not enter the church. I stood at the lich gate and looked at the building, at its crumbling walls and broken windows, and the dark space behind the altar where the recess is located. And I thought I saw, just for an instant, a pale face at one of those windows, a face that watched me with an expression of infinite patience and infinite hunger. I did not stay to investigate. I returned to Cambridge that same day and have not visited Fenstowe since. This manuscript is published not as a work of fiction, but as a historical document, the testimony of a careful and rational man who experienced something that shook the foundations of his understanding. Whether his experience was real or imagined is less important perhaps than the warning it contains. There are places where the past is not quite past. There are objects that should not be disturbed. There are boundaries between the living and the dead that must not be crossed carelessly. Dr. Dunning learned this lesson at great cost. His account stands as a caution to all who, like him, pursue knowledge without regard for the dangers that knowledge may bring. May we be wise enough to heed it. Editorial note. This edition of Dr. James Dunning's manuscript is published by the Cambridge Antiquarian Society, 1928. Copies may be obtained by application to the Society's offices. Those wishing to visit St. Eldred's Church, Fenstowe, are respectfully advised to do so only during daylight hours, and to refrain from attempting to enter the building without proper authorization from the diocesan authorities. The editor wishes to note that during the preparation of this volume, 3 separate researchers engaged to verify details of Dr. Dunning's account have withdrawn from the project, citing personal reasons. The present editor completed the work, but admits to a certain reluctance to pursue further investigations. Some questions, perhaps, are better left unanswered. Some doors are better left closed. Finis.